it kind of just hit me today, honestly, like we're really coming up on the draft. Like it is like here practically.
As somebody who is also like kind of half covering the Cavs playoffs, like these next few weeks are like a sprint in Cleveland sports. But yeah, the draft has definitely snuck up. We were just talking about the Athletics before we recorded. The Dane Brugler's The Beast draft guide just came out, and for me, when that comes out every year, that's like when this is getting real.
Yeah, 2 weeks from Friday, the Browns will be on the clock. That's how close we are to the draft. So you put up a story about how the Browns, what a best case scenario looks like for the Browns without a first round pick for the second straight year here. And in fact, they won't have a second round pick either. Now they didn't have one last year, but we didn't know that until they actually traded down. We know it this year going in, so it feels a little bit different. So what did you come away feeling like a win looks like for the Browns, or a best case scenario looks like for the Browns without a first or second?
Yeah, so like I got this idea because I saw PFF like did the best case scenario for every team without a first round pick. And for the Browns, like their answer was, well, they beef up the defensive line. And for me, it's like, yeah, I think that's like a valid want. If you're a Browns fan, if you're an analyst, like what do they need? They need that. But I think I combined that with this regime and what we know they tend to look at. And I mean, I just think it's clear at this point, they're not going to be backed into that needs-based corner. Like it's just not going to happen. It's not how they think. Like I truly take to heart that need agnostic quote from Andrew Berry. And I think we saw that last year. Like no one was expecting them to take Martin Emerson. Like everyone's like, they're great at quarterback. They don't need another person. And it was their first pick. If there's a guy they like for a value they deem acceptable, I think that's who they're going to go after. So for me, like the best case scenario isn't tied to a specific position. It's more tied to whether they can find somebody like a Martin Emerson who maybe gets ahead of schedule with their development, can maybe step in a bit more than we think. Because the reality for me is at the end of the day, a third rounder is very, very likely not going to be a franchise altering player. Like you're looking for a guy who could maybe eventually be a starter. So I think the quicker that guy can step into that role, that's like a win.
Yeah, I mean, Martin Emerson's a great example of a guy where you found some value, a guy who was able to come in and contribute, but you're just as likely to get an Alex Wright or a David Bell who just didn't do a whole lot last year for this team. And we'll see kind of what they do in year two, but they're not afraid to take guys that maybe aren't going to contribute right away, that they believe they can get into their building and develop. So, there's a chance that you could come out of day two of the draft without a starter, which is, I mean, I guess that's fine. That's what they've been using free agency to do. And that's how they've been sort of building this roster up. But it's just sort of a weird thing that like, we're going to spend the weekend talking about all these players. And then when football starts in September, I don't know. I don't know what the roles are going to be.
Yeah. And I think a lot of it like depends on the position they draft at. Like, is it somebody that, is it feasibly a position that they can step in and start right away? Like, I think obviously if you take a receiver, that person's not going to step in and start right away because they have three guys who can already do that. So I do think a lot of it depends on that too. But yeah, I mean, like they got lucky with Martin Emerson last year. I think he came along, like they obviously always really liked him. They liked his length, like his demeanor, his physicality, all that kind of stuff. But I just still think, like, even though we saw him, I remember, like, seeing him out at rookie minicamp and being like, that guy's, like, big. Like, you can just tell, and we talk about this. Sometimes you look at these guys and you're like, they look different than everybody else out there. They look like they belong, with the rest of an NFL roster, essentially. And he was a guy like that, I think. And I think we talked about it on the podcast at the time. So it just really is, I think, the only way to classify like a win versus a loss, or like a best case scenario versus a worst case scenario, because the most likely scenario is you get a guy who's going to have to develop for a few years, and like it is what it is. Maybe he's a contributor, maybe you move on from him after his rookie deal. But like Martin Emerson is a surefire kind of win, a draft win for me at that sort of spot in that range.